Welcome to church history again. Um, so I was thinking about trying to get closer to wrapping up, and then I got into actually preparing the lesson, and it looks like there might be a few more times beyond what I thought. There's plenty of good material. Um, but last time, if you remember, we covered the topic of revival because it was the week before the Barbers came, and we jumped forward in history to talk about the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening. And then before that, we left off in the 16th century, the 1500s, right after Henry VIII had a dispute with the Pope over his marriage and decided to break away from the Roman Church, politically at least. And then he wanted to have the Church of England function outside of papal authority. And if you remember, most of that lesson was about the history of the English Church, just the English Church, which at first glance might not seem relevant to us as Baptists. We're not Episcopalians, we're not Anglicans, so why would that be relevant to us? Any thoughts?
Yeah, but it's not coming to relevant. Oh, because they still persecuted the, not Anabaptists maybe, but they're still responsible for the persecution that drove people out of England to then eventually came to America.
Yes, so the Anglican Church did persecute uh, groups that were called nonconformists that didn't conform to the state church. Um, so that's one connection. Any other thoughts?
Church of Anglican.
Well, I chose to look at the English Church because it is the historical ancestor to many of the denominations we see in our English-speaking world today, especially here in America. Episcopalians, of course, which are just American Anglicans, and Presbyterians, not directly related, but still related. Congregationalists, which their descendants today would be the United Church of Christ, and Baptists, and Methodists, and several other groups that we aren't going to talk about. All of those denominations at one point either came out of the English Church or were controlled by it, whether they were in agreement with it or in disagreement with it. And those who disagreed with the English Church were called nonconformists because they didn't conform to the rules of the state church. We aren't going to talk about the Methodists today because they come later down the line, but we're going to cover three of the denominations I just mentioned, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists. And in talking about them, we're also going to talk about a group that sort of encompasses them all, at least in their roots, the Puritans. So we last left off with Henry VIII and his Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Henry VIII was initially content to keep the church functioning as a Catholic church, just a Catholic church without the Pope. Does anyone remember the book that he wrote?
Oh, I have it written down. No, I don't remember off the top of my head.
It might be surprising to some people. It was because of this book that the English monarch attained the title Defender of the Faith, and that was when England was still Catholic. Henry VIII wrote a book against the Reformation in Europe called Defense of the Seven Sacraments. So he was very anti-Reformation in the beginning, and then less so when it became more convenient for him later on. But throughout his life, he still considered himself a Catholic, just not always a Roman Catholic. Thomas Cranmer, however, had been looking for an opportunity to bring the ideas of the Reformation into the English church, and he took advantage of the break from Rome to do just that. And most famously, he created what is called the Book of Common Prayer, which is a sort of a service book. Um, it's not quite, I guess, a comparison might be a hymnal, except it's more than songs. It's an order of worship. And has prayers and scripture readings and devotions and um, instructions for special occasions, a church calendar, and things like that. So the Catholics have the same thing. It's called a missal. But what Cranmer did was he took that missal and he removed Catholic ideas from it, like works-based salvation, and replaced them with Protestant doctrine and theology, and tried to make it more scripturally based.
Is it missal or missalette?
Uh, I'm not sure of the difference.
And was it like a combination of all those other things in a catechism book, or was it not meant to be a catechism book either?
Well, I guess it does do some catechizing to a certain extent. It has the creeds are one thing that are recited, and the prayers are meant to help create a scriptural or a pattern of um, a regular pattern of prayer or habit of prayer, I guess, for when people weren't sure how to pray just by themselves. Um, but so it's not directly catechism or catechizing like in question and answer, but it shares some similarities with that, I suppose. And catechisms came later with, well, we'll talk about that shortly. And there will be another surprise there. So the Book of Common Prayer is still in use today in the Anglican Church and Anglican denominations, and a lot of other Reformed denominations like the Presbyterians and let's see, well, the Lutherans aren't a uppercase R Reformed denomination, but some of their service books have also been influenced by it. So Cranmer created the Book of Common Prayer, and he also started working on a doctrinal statement for the Church of England, which would set out its ideas that were separate from Catholicism. So today, the English Church has the 39 Articles of Religion, and Thomas Cranmer wrote I think in his time it was the 10 Articles of Religion, and we'll talk more about that later. So he and several other leaders in the English Church took advantage of the break from Rome to start the English Reformation, and to bring Protestant ideas to England. Unfortunately, so even though Henry VIII wasn't Protestant himself, he tolerated Protestantism after the break from Rome. But then after he died, Mary Tudor took the throne. And has anyone ever heard of Mary Tudor?
Yeah, Bloody Mary.
Yes, nicknamed Bloody Mary because of a lot of what happened under her reign. She took the throne as a Catholic, and there was a lot of opposition to her from Protestants, of course, and so because they were opposed to her religiously, that could also pose a threat to her politically. And so hundreds of Protestant leaders were either imprisoned or executed or exiled. And Cranmer was among them. And so there's a story. Cranmer eventually gave in to pressure and guess, recanted his Protestant ideas, um, which would have um, reconciled him with the Catholic Church and um, brought him back there, I guess. But Mary kept him in prison because she saw him as a political opponent and still sent him to execution. And then when he was being executed, um, he then repented of um, his, I guess you could maybe call it backsliding, I don't know. Um, and see, I don't remember if it was him or if it was someone else. I think it was him. He was burned at the stake, and he put the hand that had signed off on the recantation into the fire first. Um, so he wavered, but then he died a martyr. Of course, Mary's reign didn't last forever. And eventually she died, and then Elizabeth I came to the throne. She was more open to Protestantism. She wasn't fully Protestant or Catholic herself, but she tried to bring unity to England and to the church and tried to tolerate both the more Catholic-leaning parts of the English church and the more Protestant parts of the English church. And so during that time, Protestant leaders and thinkers who had been exiled came back to England. And then many of them started challenging parts of the Anglican Church that they felt were too Catholic. So they wanted the Reformation to continue, going beyond what Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, another leader during Henry VIII's reign, had done. And so they and the people who followed them became known as Puritans because they wanted to purify the church from Catholic influences. When we think of Puritans today, we often think of like one specific group almost as if they were a denomination. But really, there was a lot of diversity among Puritans. They were generally reformed in their doctrine or in their theology, but they disagreed on practical issues and how far to reform the church. Excuse me. And what church government could look like. And so you could have a Puritan who is more Episcopal, or you could have some even consider early Presbyterians as Puritans. They weren't really a homogenous group, but they were united in their desire to purify the church and ground it more in Scripture. And so naturally, some were more moderate, and then others were more radical. And so the 39 Articles of Religion were finalized in 1571 as a way to bring a sort of stability to what the Anglican Church stood for. And the goal was to clearly separate Anglican teaching from the excesses of Catholicism, but also to distinguish it from other Protestant groups that were appearing in England and in Europe. So for example, Article 22 speaks against the doctrines of purgatory, religious relics, and praying to the saints, which that sounds Protestant. But then Article 23 prohibits public preaching by unordained men. And Article 10 speaks out against some ideas of free will with regard to salvation. And so not all Protestants would have disagreed with that, but many would, especially those that today would be considered lower church, like the Arminians and Anabaptists and eventually others that were Baptist, Congregationalists, Nonconformists.
They were called the lower church?
Well, So lower church and higher church is more of a way of thinking today, I guess. So a way of looking at denominations as far as how liturgical they are, um, uh, how much tradition they have versus what they um, what they've kept and what they haven't kept. So higher church denominations would be uh, closer to, would look and feel more Catholic, and then lower church denominations would look and feel more like us or Baptists, as far as having a specific rituals and orders of service and specific um, specific things to do, and also in more of an authority structure in church government. So lower churches have lower church denominations have more of a congregational polity or lean towards that, and then higher church denominations have more of an Episcopal church structure. But I don't think the idea of low church versus high church came about until much later. But
Is that a derogatory term, or just happen to be higher and lower church?
I don't know. I don't know if it was derogatory or not. I've always seen it just as a descriptor.
Okay.
But so putting that back on history, even though using it to describe history, even though it wasn't a term used at the time, most Puritans, or at least the early Puritans, would have been more of a higher church in their way of life and their practice. But then later on, as the Puritans got more radical, then you would have more lower church ideas, and people trying to create a greater degree of separation from the church authority structure and hierarchy and things that they saw as vestiges of Catholicism, like vestments or decorations in church or things like that.
So if Puritan was across the denomination, was there a common thread, either in your writing or your stance, that you had to attain to or support to be labeled that, or did each denomination just label the Puritans within their group themselves?
Well, so Puritan was, excuse me, originally a label that was put on people, just used generally to describe those who didn't agree with the Anglican Church completely, and some groups within that embraced it, and others didn't embrace it, and some actually called themselves Puritans. But what was your original question? I'm sorry.
I was just wondering how they were labeled that. Did since it was interdenominational, was there certain things they had to adhere to that made them a Puritan, or was it just the fact that they tried to purify their own denomination? Sounds to me like initially it might have been a derogatory comment to them. What are you trying to do, purify the church?
Yes, so at this point, there weren't really, the idea of denominations wasn't really a thing, and that didn't appear until about 100 years, I'd say, after the Reformation. A lot of, well, even jumping back to Europe a little bit, Martin Luther, when he started the Reformation, he didn't want to start an entirely new church.
Right.
And then even when he did, he wanted there to be one united Protestant church, um, which didn't happen because of disagreements in theology. But a lot of the reformers didn't see themselves as trying to create a new church or a new denomination, but rather as trying to um, purify the existing church. But then as their idea of what that looked like changed from what the old church looked like, then their existing churches became separate denominations. So you have the Puritans, and we often think of Puritans in the American context as being in New England. Here's a question: Were we of course all know the story of the Pilgrims? Were the Pilgrims Puritans?
Could there have been some in there?
Well, so yes, the um, the Pilgrims were very similar to the Puritans in a lot of their ideas, but they were more radical. And rather than trying to stay within the church and reform it, they wanted to separate from the church entirely. And so they were a smaller group than the Puritans in general. So they were called separatists. And the separatist group that came over to New England initially on the Mayflower, they were separatists. And then later on, when the larger Puritan group began to be persecuted in England, then they fled to New England and took over. And so today we sort of see them as the same thing, even though they were slightly different. So Puritans agreed with most or all of the 39 articles. So they agreed with a lot of the theology of the Anglican Church, but they disagreed with the church on smaller things like church aesthetics and forms of worship. Separatists, on the other hand, a lot of them came from Puritan backgrounds, but then they wanted to leave the Anglican Church entirely and start their own separate churches. So we will talk more about separatists in a little bit. Going back to the timeline of history, with Elizabeth I, and then her successor James managed to keep a balance between those who wanted a radical reform in the church and those who preferred to keep the traditions of the church that weren't expressly Catholic, at least in their view. And one of the most famous acts of James was the calling together of scholars from across the spectrum to work on a new translation of the Bible, which was first published in 1611 and today bears his name. So that was an effort to try to unify, bring unity to different camps within the English church. And so Elizabeth and James did a fairly good job of keeping stability in England and balancing opposing people with opposing ideas against each other in a way that there wasn't conflict. James's son Charles, however, was not as good at keeping the peace. And Puritans had been gradually getting more radical in their ideas and assertive about their views. And rather than acknowledge their concerns and try to work out a balance with them, Charles intentionally provoked his opponents by intentionally doing the opposite. One thing he did, for example, was to marry a Catholic from France, despite being explicitly told by his advisors and parliaments not to do that. And then another thing that he did was he tried to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Church. Um, so there was the English Church and there was the Scottish Church, and this is where we get the relationship between Presbyterians and the English Church. James the First was James the First of England, but he was James the Sixth of Scotland. And so when he came to the throne of England, then the Scottish Church was under his control as well as the English Church. And there was also a lot of interaction between the English Church and the Scottish Church during the Reformation. And both were reformed in their views. But the Scottish Church had developed its own ideas and a system of government and worship. And so James trying to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on the Church of Scotland didn't go over well with them. There's one story of a woman who supposedly sparked what's called the Bishop's War by throwing a stool at a minister in the middle of a church service who was using the Book of Common Prayer. And so the Bishop's War was a rebellion against Charles, in which the Scots tried to, not tried, they successfully overthrew the English influence on their church and removed the English bishops from their church. And so Charles went to war against them, and he lost. And that wasn't the first war that he got involved in. So the tension and power struggle between him and the Puritans and others eventually burst into a civil war when he tried to dissolve. So at this time in English history, Parliament was not the full legislative body that it is today. It was the purpose of Parliament was to sometimes to advise the king when it was called, but it was also Parliament was the body that could raise taxes. Without Parliament, there were no taxes. And so Charles needed Parliament to agree to taxation so that he could get money for his war on Scotland. And so he convened Parliament, and Parliament refused to talk about giving him money to make war on Scotland until he addressed other issues such as the English Church and their concerns with the liturgy and other things there. And so he didn't like that, and he decided that he was going to try to go it alone and try to function without money. And so he tried to dissolve the Parliament, and they refused to go home. They just kept staying in session. And so as long as they were in session, they had a sort of legitimacy to their role or their power. They were representatives of the people. And so eventually that turned into a civil war between parliamentarians, the people who supported Parliament, and the royalists, people who supported King Charles. And one was more Puritan, and the other was more Catholic or maybe Anglo-Catholic. And so the Civil War, the English Civil War, lasted almost a decade, and its result was the execution of King Charles I, and it led to the institution of a republic. which unfortunately didn't last long, and then it turned into a quote-unquote protectorate, or something, perhaps something similar to what we would today consider a dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell. And in the midst of the Civil War, with the king out of power, the Puritans decided to have a conference to further reform and try to define the doctrine of the Anglican Church further. And so they met at Westminster from 1643 to 1647 and set down a series of documents called the Westminster Standards, which included the smaller catechism and the greater catechism and the Westminster Confession. So when you hear about the Westminster Confession, which denomination do you usually associate that with? Well, let's see.
If they weren't around.
Yes, so the Presbyterians use the Westminster Confession as one of their main confessions. And so you might be surprised that the Westminster Confession was actually drawn up as a confession of the Anglican Church rather than as a confession of the Presbyterian Church. So why did the Presbyterians adopt it as one of their confessions? Well, the Presbyterians had a part in writing it. The later English Puritans, the more radical Puritans, and the Presbyterians were similar in that they both sought to reform the established church. The Puritans reformed the English church, and the Presbyterians reformed the Scottish church, both of which had been under the political authority of the King of England. And then in the English Civil War, the Presbyterians actually joined the Puritans in fighting against the King of England. And they both had similar Reformed theology. And then at Westminster, the Puritans even agreed to adopt a Presbyterian form of government for the Anglican Church. Unfortunately for them, the Westminster Standards were later rejected by the Anglican Church when the monarchy was restored. And so when Charles II returned to the throne, he reestablished royal and episcopal authority. But the Anglican Church could have been Presbyterian. In the Scottish Church, however, the Presbyterians who had been involved in writing the Westminster Confession, they retained it. So we've talked a little bit about the Presbyterians in the past with John Knox. Excuse me. He was a Catholic clergyman in Scotland who converted to Protestantism after reading Luther's work. He traveled and preached throughout Scotland during the Reformation, was imprisoned on a galley ship by Mary, Queen of Scots, different from Mary Tudor. And he spent time preaching in England until Mary Tudor came to the throne in England and forced him to leave. And then he ended up going to Geneva in Switzerland to preach and to study with John Calvin. And so we know John Calvin today mostly for his theology, but in addition to theology, he also had developed a system of church government based on the rule of elders or presbyters in local congregations, which were then connected with each other by elected overseers rather than by appointed bishops. And John Knox brought that system back to Scotland when he returned, and through his work in the Scottish Reformation, the Church of Scotland adopted the Presbyterian model of government. So that's the origins of the Presbyterians. And before they took over the Church of Scotland, Presbyterians were nonconformists because they did not conform to the doctrine and the practice of the established church. Another group of nonconformists were the Congregationalists. Congregationalists were a separatist group. So they didn't want to stay within the English church or within the Anglican church. And they generally held to Reformed theology, but they believed in a congregational form of church government, rather than a church being run by bishops or overseen by elders like the Presbyterians. Each individual congregation would be self-governing. So needless to say, they rejected the authority of the already established church and sought to function independently from it, which distinguished them from the Puritans. And as a result, they were persecuted by the Anglican Church and fled to Scotland, and then a small group of, or not to Scotland, to Holland, and a small group of them then came to America on the Mayflower. We often confuse Congregationalists with Puritans today because of their similar theology and because Puritans followed Congregationalists to America, and they eventually merged in New England. Early Congregationalists in England included John Bunyan, who wrote the Pilgrim's Progress, and he was imprisoned for preaching without a license, and John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. So lastly, I'm going to talk about another group of nonconformists, very similar to the Congregationalists. Any guesses?
Baptists.
The Baptists, yes.
So what were the predominant denomination in Holland when the Congregationists went there?
Well, so Holland at this time was, you had, it was the lower country, so you had you had the Netherlands and Belgium, and so it was, I don't remember if it was still at this time, it was at one point in time it was controlled by Spain, which was Catholic, and then at some point during or after the Reformation, the lower countries split in two, and the southern half, which became Belgium, remained Catholic, and the northern part got its independence from Spain and became Protestant. And so they were, they had their own Reformation. And so there's actually a denomination today called the Dutch Reformed Church, which is similar to Presbyterians in a lot of ways. Let's see. I think, oh, Holland was also where there were a lot of Anabaptists. I think that's where the Mennonites first started, where Menno Simons was from, or at least where he made his ideas known. So I guess the answer to your question would be the Reformed Church, generally.
Makes sense.
Would be the biggest denomination in Holland.
There were a lot of Dutch Reform where I was from in Michigan. A lot of people from Holland.
Hmm.
Matter of fact, Holland, Michigan.
Oh, Holland, Michigan.
Yeah. Yep.
It's amazing how you can travel around the world without ever leaving a state.
Yeah, like in New York City.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, let's see. I don't remember how we got onto Holland, but the Baptists did end up in Holland for a short while. So if you remember, John Smith was one of the early leaders of the Baptist movement who moved to Holland due to persecution. And while he was there, he started the first modern Baptist church with Thomas Helwys. Smith was originally an Anglican, and then he became a Puritan, and then he became a separatist or Congregationalist, and then when he was in Holland, he became a Baptist. Does anyone know what the main difference between Congregationalists and Baptists was?
The mode of baptism?
Well, Mode of baptism is part of it.
Who they baptize, infants or adults?
Yes, so baptism in general, the kind of baptism. So Congregationalists followed most of the rest of the Reformed world in practicing paedobaptism, which is the baptism of infants. But Baptists practice credobaptism, which is baptizing only adult professors of the faith. So when John Smith became a Baptist, or became convinced of the need for a baptism of adults on a profession of faith, he didn't know anyone else with those same views, and so he baptized himself and then baptized his congregation. And that was a source of insecurity for him because he was concerned that his baptism hadn't been valid because he had done it on himself. And so
Taking comfort in the fact that the majority of people in Jesus' day probably baptized themselves
he probably could have taken comfort in that.
because they had I forget the name of the apparatus, but they were like 50-gallon drums in the pavement or in the surface of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
and they went in. They were purifying tubs, and that's how they baptized themselves. There wasn't room for anybody else,
Mm-hmm.
so he wasn't too far off from what they did in John the Baptist's time.
So yeah, he wasn't too far off. For those at home, he wasn't too far off from what people did in biblical times. There was Jewish rite of purification, dipping themselves in water. And so a lot of people might have baptized themselves in early Christian times as well. But John Smith didn't know about that, and so he was concerned. And then he met Mennonites who also practiced credo baptism, and so he asked to join them. And he died before he could be accepted by them. And at that point, Thomas Helwys took over leadership of the congregation and led them back to England. And then they established the First Baptist Church in England. And he and his congregation were then imprisoned, but Baptists persevered, and they even wrote books about their beliefs, especially on religious liberty, and sent them directly to the king to be read, even though the king was the one who was imprisoning them. And then eventually you have your first Baptist confession of faith, the London Baptist Confession. And I think its final version was in 1689. So we'll stop there for tonight. And next lesson, we might actually get to America.